Welcome yet again to Can You Believe It? On this channel, we make every effort to address complex and not so complex sociological, psychological, historical, and theological issues about life here on God's green earth. Well, sometimes political. We believe that all truth is God's truth, whether that truth is found in the social sciences and mathematics and physics, chemistry, or in nature. Our premise is founded on the basis that all truth, all truth is God's truth, and therefore it's our responsibility as created human beings to find that truth wherever it may be found, analyze it, and share it with all creatures, big and small. Well, since it's Resurrection Sunday on the year 2024, someone asked me to put up a statement on whether the resurrection of Jesus was a true historical event. Did it really happen? Or are we just being led on a blind path and fed mythological story from the pulpits? For thousands of years now, Christians continue to make the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And every Sunday, Christians around the world recite and believe in the following words: the third day he rose again from the dead. But the question we need to ask ourselves is this: is this statement true? If it's true, where is the evidence? Can we possibly take this claim seriously, even in the 21st century? Can the science of textual criticism and archaeological findings and discoveries, and also historical writings support this claim? You see, if it is true that Jesus rose from the dead, then the facts behind the resurrection story provide us with a solid basis to the claims of Christianity. If, in fact, we can argue that if it is true that Jesus rose from the dead, our whole approach to life matters. Our hope for the future and the subject of death changes completely. While most religious teachers and religions teach that we are saved based on the good works we do, Christianity, on the other hand, teaches that we are saved on the basis of what Jesus did. Therefore, resurrection was God's confirmation to us humans, to humanity in general, that Jesus was who he claimed to be, and his resurrection is God's assurance to Christians all over the world that forgiveness is possible. Evidence for the resurrection comes mainly from the four Gospels and the writings of Paul in the New Testament, written between 60 and 90 AD. Jesus was probably crucified in April of 33 AD. And so the gap between the events surrounding the crucifixion is much less than that of any credible soldier today reporting on his Second World War experiences. The best evidence comes from the 15th chapter of Paul in his first letter to Christians in the city of Corinth. And that letter was written about 55 AD. In the text, Paul gives a list of witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, including himself. Some other significant evidence also emerged to support this evidence that Paul presents. First, there were the first two witnesses who were women. It's interesting to note that during the first century, women were viewed as not as credible or bearers of any reliable witness or evidence. But in this case, we find two women who were bearers of the good news that Sunday morning. Second, the 12 disciples of Jesus, apart from Judas Iscariot, were witnesses to the resurrection event. Third, Paul recounts Jesus' appearing to over 500 people at one time, most of whom were still alive to testify when he was writing most of his letters. 22 years later. That's a big number of eyewitnesses to kind of just ignore. Fourth, Paul himself met Christ on his way to Damascus, on that Damascus road. He encountered the Lord of creation, and out of that encounter, Paul was changed tremendously. And from that experience, he became an ardent opponent of the faith, to being the most zealous disciple of all time. Therefore, introducing his list of resurrection appearances, Paul writes, I deliver to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ was raised on the third day. When Paul got this information, he was a changed man. But we can also ask ourselves this question. When did Paul receive this information? Well, Paul was in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion experience. And in Jerusalem, he met Peter and James, who was the brother of Jesus. Given that his conversion was about 3 years after Christ's death, he must have received the information from Peter and James no more than 6 years after the resurrection event. Some try to discredit this event by saying that the disciples must have stolen the body of Jesus. Well, this fake news was deliberately circulated by the Jewish authorities, the chief priest, and the Pharisees who want Jesus dead. The theory implies that the disciples colluded with one another to spread a lie. The only problem with this approach is that some of the disciples had to die for their belief in the resurrection story itself. Therefore, it could have not have been possible. It is impossible to have more than 12 men die miserably for a lie. Nobody dies for something they know to be false. Surely someone, one of them, one of these 12 men would have broken the code of silence if at all they had conspired to spread a lie. There is more considerable evidence for Jesus' resurrection. In fact, in the book of Acts, for instance, Paul, or rather Luke, told Theophilus that after Jesus suffered and died, Jesus proved he was alive again. The truth of the resurrection is this: resurrection is central to the Christian faith, and it is so essential that if it did not happen, then the Christian faith can be described as vain and fake. We can all agree, therefore, that anyone wanting to disapprove Christianity would have to discredit the historicity or the historical evidence behind the resurrection story. So either the resurrection happened and Jesus is who he claimed to be, or it didn't happen and Jesus is not what he said he was. The biblical accounts of resurrection are therefore historical and worthy investigating. And that's why we're here. C.S. Lewis also stated that Jesus' resurrection is at the very core of the message preached by his disciples. And for them to preach Christianity meant primarily to preach the resurrection of Christ. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 17, if resurrection did not happen, then our faith is futile. We are still in our sins. And if that's the case, resurrection story is the biggest hoax mankind has ever known. But if Christians are right and that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, then that's a game changer for all of humanity. And the most vital piece of historical information that every human being must know for the sake of their own future and souls. If Jesus, again, resurrected from the dead, every person must reckon with that fact and the implications of that historical event. Besides the four gospel writers who were eyewitnesses, we also have other historians who wrote about the crucifixion of Jesus. Josephus, for example, the Jewish historian, records of the resurrection event. Tacitus and Pliny the Younger also record of the resurrection event. Manuscripts of the book Antiquities of the Jews, written by the first century Jewish historian by the name of Josephus around 93 to 94 AD, contains two references of Jesus of Nazareth and one reference to John the Baptist. The first and most extensive reference to Jesus in the Antiquities, found in book number 18, states that Jesus was the Messiah and a wise teacher who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. Josephus, therefore, provides the longest secular reference to Jesus in the first century AD. Later, when he reports events from the administration of the Roman governor Albinus in about 62 to 64 AD, he also talks about Jesus in the Antiquities in chapter 20. He once again mentions Jesus in connection with the death of James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, who was also Jesus's half brother. These passages, along with other non-biblical and non-Christian references, mention of Jesus. Tacitus, for example, in Annals 15th chapter, mentions of Jesus. Suetonius in Claudius chapter 25 mentions of Jesus, and Pliny the Young in his letter to Trojan mentions of this particular Jesus who was crucified. These facts, therefore, prove conclusively that any denial of Jesus's historicity would be an academic suicide. This is what Josephus writes, and I quote, "After this time, or about this time, lived Jesus, a wise man. If indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was the achiever of extraordinary deeds and was a teacher of those who accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When he was indicted by the principal men among us, and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him originally did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them on the third day, restored to life. As the prophets of the deity had foretold these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day." End of quote. That's Josephus writing about Jesus. So, where is the evidence for the resurrection of Christ? Let's consider the evidence from the empty tomb. The empty tomb stands as a veritable rock, real and an authentic proof and an essential element in the evidence for the resurrection. It is a matter of history that the apostles made many converts in Jerusalem by proclaiming that Christ had risen from the grave. And any one of their hearers could have visited the tomb to cross-check this evidence for themselves and to discredit them if indeed the tomb was not empty. If the body of the one who they proclaimed as risen Lord was decomposing in Joseph's tomb, someone would have called their bluff. The Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the high priest would have called them out on this lie because they wanted Christ to stay dead anyways. On the other hand, there are those who say that Christ's body was stolen. Christ's body surely could not have been stolen, for Roman military guards were posted to prevent anybody from stealing the body. These guys had thought this plan through. The Roman soldiers, therefore, would have had no reason, they had no reason to steal or collaborate with anyone to take Jesus' body. For failure to perform their duty would have meant that they be executed. Doing so would have jeopardized their own lives. They would have been fired on the spot. Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 through 14 reads, and I quote, While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. When the chief priest had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say," I quote, "his disciples came during the night and stole him away while they were asleep." End of quote. The Roman authorities instructed the guards to say they were asleep and that the body of Jesus had been stolen. But how could they have known if they were asleep? You see, the lie doesn't add up very well. Furthermore, the tomb was filled by 2 ton stone. It is therefore absurd to think that anyone could have overcome the guards, moved the massive rock, removed the body, tightly pressed the clothes that Jesus was wrapped in, and slipped away in the middle of the night without being noticed. Also, remember the disciples had been trembling in fear were hiding, having fled when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane. The claim that Jesus' body was stolen is therefore absolutely irrational and senseless. Before the resurrection, the disciples of Jesus were scattered and nowhere to be found. However, after the resurrection, we see them becoming bold and outspoken in their faith. Let's stop here for now and continue with our examination of these facts during our next episode. This is Can You Believe It? Jesus rose from the dead. He is indeed risen, and everybody else stays in their grave, waiting for the resurrection of the dead. Thank you.